Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Taborsky. He is the director of the Behavioural Ecology Department and co-director of the Institute of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Bern in Switzerland. His major research focus is the adaptive function of behavior with emphasis on cooperation and conflict, sociality and sexual reproduction, and today we're going to focus mostly on the evolution of cooperation and altruism and also on sexual reproduction and among other topics. So Dr. Taborsky, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a real honor to be on your program. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, so before we get into the specific topics, let me just ask you, in your work, what are the species that you've been focusing the most on?
Well, I've been working on quite a few animal taxa. Perhaps my major focus throughout my academic career was on African cichlids, little fish from Lake Tanganyika, mainly in East Africa. But I've been working also on cuckoos and kiwis and on firebugs and all sorts of different animals. Currently, my group is working on Norway rats, on ambrosia beetles, and on cooperatively breeding African cichlids.
Yeah, and was there any particular reason why you chose those species? Was it because it allowed for you to study the particular topics you are most interested in, or was it just due to chance?
No, this is exactly the reason. I mean, I'm interested in, as you already briefly introduced, I'm interested in evolutionary mechanisms or selection mechanisms that cause social behavior and that cause especially particular adaptations involving cooperation to solve competition for resources. And the three systems that we are currently studying have different benefits to study such questions experimentally. To briefly explain why this is the case, the African cichlids that we study show a cooperative breeding system which is involving highly delicate interactions between different members of groups that sort of negotiate about how much each individual is participating in the duties that benefit other group members. In the rats, we have the possibility to ask in which way previous social experience causes responses of focal experimental animals. For example, if an individual has received help from a social partner, does that increase its chance to pay something back to the same or to different individuals? And in the ambrosia beetles, we have a group of animals that shows all preconditions for the highest levels of sociality. But interestingly, Eusociality, which is the highest form of sociality, where a large proportion of the individuals in a species do not reproduce themselves, they just help raising offspring of others. This highest level of sociality is not exemplified by this group, even though it has a combination of all preconditions in this direction. So that is a very interesting system to see what limits the evolution of this highest form of sociality.
I mean, regarding eusociality, I would like to ask you if for eusociality to occur, all of the individuals of a particular colony, for example, or community or group, have to be all of them genetically related or not?
Yes, I mean, eusociality, as I understand it, there are different definitions of it, but I think the most constructive definition is that it involves individuals or a proportion of the population or group that does not reproduce lifelong. That is important. Yeah. So they are not able to produce offspring independently. They are just able to raise offspring that others have produced. And in such a case, if you rely on the production of offspring by others, this can only be explained by what we call kin selection. So this is a mechanism that involves the raising or the support, the enhancement of offspring that you have not produced yourself, but closely related individuals have produced. So this is a very special form, and many people regard it as a step towards organismality. So people talk about eusocial groups as superorganism, because the workers, the individuals that do not reproduce, serve like organs of an organism. They cannot persist independently of the queen, how it is usually called, the female that produces the offspring. So this is a very interesting step in evolution, a major transition towards the highest levels of sociality. And this form of sociality is found in several groups. The most well-known group are the Hymenoptera, including ants and certain bees and wasp species. But it's also found in other groups, in shrimps, for example, in thrips. There are several invertebrates that show this kind of social pattern. There is at least two vertebrate species that go in that direction. These are the mole rats of Africa. But it has been shown that they remain totipotent for their life, even though most individuals will never reproduce themselves during their life. They have the potential to, and if something happens to the reproductive individuals, they can take over. So this is a sort of border case of eusociality.
Mm-hmm. So at a certain point there, I think that you mentioned, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that eusociality is also pointed toward as a possible step in the direction of organismality. Was that the word that you used, right?
Exactly, yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Yeah, yes. So would that mean that perhaps we could also, in evolutionary history, look back at, for example, single cells or even groups of cells, colonies of cells, for example, that was one step toward multicellular organisms as eusocial as well?
Yes, I mean this is a very good question. I mean we can see this kind of step in current organisms, for example, in slime molds, where individuals of well, I mean the single cells are more or less independent. They can move independently, they have independent metabolism, they feed independently and show responses to the environment independently. But for sexual reproduction, they sort of combine forces. They flow together and build what is called a fruiting body that consists of a stalk and spore capsules. And some individuals wander into these spore capsules and are then reproducing. The majority of individuals is not reproducing. They're just building the stalk. But because they are more or less clonal, they are genetically identical, of course also the individuals that build the stalk reproduce indirectly, yeah, by the relatedness to the ones that make spores and are then distributed. So this is a very nice example of these evolutionary steps towards organismality, which means, in effect, that part of the individuals of a group are not able to reproduce anymore, and are closely related to the ones that reproduce. And this close relatedness causes a reduction in conflict. Yeah, if there is a difference, a genetic difference between individuals in a group, in whatever social unit you look at, there is competition. There's competition for resources, there's competition for reproduction. But if individuals are very closely related and through evolutionary steps have lost their independent ability to reproduce, then there is no conflict anymore. And that is the step that is necessary for building an organism. Yeah, the cells in our body are not able to reproduce independently. They need the other cells in the body, and therefore there is no conflict between them, except in the case of cancer, where individual cells mutate and suddenly develop a sort of self-interest. They are different from the other body cells, and currently take over and compete for resources within the body against other cells. So this is an example where suddenly we come up with a conflict within our body, even though we are, of course, an organism with cells that do not really have any conflict among each other, but they are bound to cooperate.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And when talking about cooperation and altruism and altruistic behavior in general, people, or at least some theorists, try to explain all of it based on a basic set of evolutionary mechanisms like kin selection, reciprocal altruism, that there are people that defend group selection. Do you think that there will be a single set of evolutionary mechanisms like the ones I've just enumerated that will explain the evolution of altruism and cooperation from all species, or do you think that we have to apply different mechanisms to different kinds of species?
Yes, I mean there are different mechanisms involved in the evolution of altruism, especially. I mean, altruism is the most interesting aspect of cooperation, because it means that you have an immediate disadvantage. Your genetic fitness is sort of immediately reduced, and that needs some compensation. And one compensation is, as I already explained, kin selection. Yeah. So if you are closely related to the receivers of your altruistic help, then your tendency to help other individuals can be transmitted in the next generation via the related individuals, yeah, because they receive a benefit at your cost. Yeah, so that is one possibility, but by far not the only one. Another possibility is that you get something back in the future. Yeah, so if you are helpful to a social partner, you may get something back in the next interaction or in the future interaction with the same individual. Yeah, and this is also found in the interspecific context. So if you look into symbiosis, yeah, where individuals of different species help each other in a way, help in quotes. One individual of one species provides a resource that an individual of the other species can use. And in exchange, it gets something back. It gets some nutrients, for example, that the first individual cannot produce themselves. So there is mutual dependence. Yeah. So that is an example on the interspecific level where cooperation, and in a way also altruistic cooperation, can be selected for. And another possibility, of course, to create cooperation that involves an immediate cost to the cooperator, to the actor, is enforcement or forcement. Yeah. So one individual forces another one to do something against its own interest, but in the interest of the enforcer, and that can work out if the cooperative response of the enforced individual is still cheaper than to resist the force, yeah, the coercion. Because, for example, you risk to be injured or even killed or something. Or one other form or facet of this is that it may be surreptitious enforcement, yeah, so that another individual is gaining something from you without you recognizing, and this can also be quite nicely illustrated by interspecific exploitation, like for example you find in European cuckoos, yeah, where the cuckoo female lays an egg in the nest of a host species, and the host species raises the cuckoo chick without any benefit to itself. It only has costs. It loses its entire brood. But because this happens relatively rarely, there is no strong selection pressure in detecting what is going on. So, and there is always the danger of making mistakes. So if you expel a cuckoo egg, but in reality it was your own egg, then this is of course also costly. So there is a kind of balance in countermeasures that depends on the frequency of the occurrence of such brood parasitism. So in a nutshell, there are four mechanisms that can create altruistic behavior. One is relatedness, kin selection. The other one is mutualism, so that you have a benefit from an action and someone else benefits as well. So this is easily to be explained. The third one is reciprocity. So you provide something to someone else and you get something back. This may be the same species or a different species. And the fourth one is exploitation or coercion, which also includes the possibility of surreptitious exploitation.
Mm-hmm. And what about group selection specifically? Because there are people that say that, for example, group selection applies in humans and other species. Do you think that the level of the group is a sufficiently good level to explain the evolution of certain traits like altruism or not?
In principle, yes. But there has been a lot of both empirical experimental studies and theoretical studies that have shown that the conditions for group selection to produce altruistic behavior are very limited. So in principle, yes, it can occur, but you need certain conditions regarding, for example, the exchange of individuals between groups, which must exist, yeah. Then there needs to be some exchange, but it needs to be very, very, very small, yeah, for group selection to create altruistic behavior. The problem with group selection is that, of course, if individuals within a group start exploiting other group members, yeah, this is very easily selected for on a short time scale. So if there is strong competition between groups and there is a mechanism to prevent competition among group members within groups, these are the conditions where group selection can work. And as I said, I mean, there are very few cases where this really can create altruistic behavior as far as we understand now. But in principle, yes, it is possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and one of the mechanisms that you referred to that would lead to the evolution of altruism was reciprocity. Could you tell us what generalized reciprocity is about?
Yes, generalized reciprocity refers to the simplest reciprocal exchange that you can think of. And reciprocal exchange is even put in quotes because it's not completely reciprocal. If animals apply generalized reciprocity, they follow the very simple decision rule: help someone if helped by someone else. Yeah, so or help anyone if helped by someone, I should say. So if you receive help or a cooperative act by a conspecific, for example, that makes you more likely to provide similar help to someone else. Yeah, not the same individual, but irrespective of the identity of the potential receiver of such a cooperative act. And this is a mechanism that works very well in humans. It's very widespread. I mean, much of our behavior is, our cooperative behavior can be explained because we follow such simple rules. Yeah, I mean, we know that everyone knows it from yourself. If you think of it, if someone is generous or you receive a generous experience, it makes you more generous for some time. Of course, this increase in your cooperative tendency vanishes with time, but for some time it makes you just more altruistic or more cooperative. And this also happens in animals. It for example, explains cooperative behavior in Norway rats, which we could show experimentally. So if a Norway rat receives help in obtaining food from a social partner, it makes it more likely to help someone else they have never met before in the near future. So it is not necessary that they meet the same individual to pay something back that they have received, but they are more generous also to other individuals.
Mm-hmm. So in your work I've also read about unconditional prosociality. What is it about, and in what ways is it distinct from reciprocity?
Yeah, there is a very important distinction. Unconditional prosociality means that you are helpful to someone else without any previous experience and without any possibility to predict that you get something back in the future. I mean, if we briefly get back to generalized reciprocity, the reason why this can evolve, this decision rule can evolve, is that by receiving help from someone, you obtain information that the social environment that you are in is cooperative. So if you are helpful to others, this may in some future interaction get back to you. Yeah, even though if this is not from the same individual that you have been helping, but by someone else, because that individual that you have been helping is also more likely to pay something back to someone else. And if you have a sort of viscosity in the population, which is the natural situation, you always have some kind of assortment in populations. The interactions between individuals are never completely random. Then it is likely that you get something back in the future, yeah, even though you cannot predict from whom, but from someone you will get something back in the future if you are helpful. So this is a mechanism that is based on information that you obtain from the population, from the behavior of others towards you. But unconditional prosociality does not involve such information. Yeah, it means that you are helpful to someone. Full stop. Yeah, and this can only be selected in groups that are closely related. Yeah, by kin selection. Yeah, because if it is likely that the receivers of your of your help are closely related, so share genes with you that probably are responsible for a similar kind of behavior, yeah, then by your prosociality, you increase the chances that this gene is distributed in the next generation, and that is how evolution works. So unconditional prosociality cannot be selected among unrelated individuals. Among unrelated individuals, it is maladaptive. This does not mean that it cannot occur, yeah, but it will not increase its chances to be proliferated from one generation to the next via natural selection.
So maybe we will be able to tie the next topic back to some of the ones that we've already been exploring, like for example, when you refer to the evolution of organisms and basically the division of labor between different parts of a colony or within a given organism between different types of cells. But do we already know exactly how and why did sexual reproduction evolve?
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, a huge topic that many people have been pondering about, starting at least with Charles Darwin. Um, Sexual reproduction is a definite puzzle, because if you reproduce asexually, you produce twice as many offspring than if you produce sexually. Because if you only produce females that, for example, pathogenetically produce offspring again, then you have twice as many offspring than if you have you produce half of your offspring as sons. However, the problem with asexual reproduction is that this reduces variance in the population, genetic variance. Yeah. So if your homeostasis, your survival, your reproduction is challenged by environmental change, by some kind of, for example, new pathogen that emerges, as all your offspring are equal or very similar to yourself, you lack the variability that some variants may do better against this new challenge than others. Yeah, everyone does equally bad or equally good. Yeah, and in the unfortunate case that your gene set cannot cope with the new challenge, that means that the whole population is wiped out. However, in sexual reproduction, you have variation. You have variation between different individuals, and this variation is perpetuated from generation to generation. So it is kept at a very high level. Yeah, and that is the explanation that evolutionary biologists have for why sexual reproduction still persists and is so widespread among organisms. Of course, we should be aware that there are many organisms that do not sexually reproduce or reproduce sexually only during certain periods. Yeah, and that is also, I think, very indicative of the ecological background of sexual versus asexual reproduction. If you have a change between sexual and asexual reproduction, as you find it in aphids, for example, you have sexual reproduction during bad times. Yeah, during times when your reproductive output is relatively low because of harsh environmental conditions or something. So you're not losing much by not using the most efficient way to reproduce, and the most efficient way to reproduce is asexual reproduction. Yeah. So in aphids they use the times when the resources are plentiful, in spring and summer, for example, when they can reproduce at very high rates. They use that by reproducing asexually, yeah, parthenogenetically, and only if the conditions deteriorate, because of seasonal variation, for example, they reproduce sexually, and by that means keep up the genetic variance within the population. Yeah, so I think this is the current status of our understanding of why sexual reproduction persists in organisms.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. And would it also, I mean, in terms of understanding sexual reproduction, the ideas that we have about it, I mean, it also depends a little bit on what we consider to be evolutionarily successful. Because if it would be just the sheer number of individuals that a particular kind of reproduction would produce and maintain, then there are bacterial species and even some insects that through asexual reproduction are, I mean, they outnumber humans, for example, and mammals in general by many orders of magnitude, right? So.
Completely correct, yes. I mean, the interesting, for behavioral ecologists, the interesting aspect of sexual reproduction is that it adds a level of competition. So, I mean, we must be aware that organisms are always in competition about resources, and conspecifics, individuals of the same species, are the greatest competitors among resources because they have the same or very similar demands. Yeah, so there's always competition, and if you reproduce sexually, there's not only competition for resources, but there's also competition for reproduction. Yeah, for sexual partners and for the ability to produce offspring with sexual partners. And that makes sexual reproduction particularly interesting for behavioral ecologists or behavioral biologists. And of course, it allows individuals also to specialize in particular tactics. Yeah, so especially in the male sex, not confined to males, but especially in the male sex, males can use different niches to compete for mates, for partners, for females. For example, you can defend resources and provide females with resources so that the females, either alone or with your help, with the male help, can not only produce but also raise offspring, if you think of species that show brood care. That enables other males that specialize in a kind of parasitic tactic to exploit these what we call bourgeois males that provide resources to the females by saving the effort and trying to fertilize eggs of females without providing them with any resources, without showing any parental effort or whatever. So you can find in many species, especially well known in fishes, but by far not confined to fishes, you find such specialized tactics that may persist throughout life, or may be conditional, so that individuals can switch between the bourgeois and the parasitic tactic depending on circumstances, on especially social circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And since we are talking about different reproductive strategies, what are fixed and plastic reproductive strategies?
Yeah, this refers exactly to these two different possibilities that I just was briefly referring to. So we talk about a fixed strategy if an individual keeps its tactic throughout life. Yeah. So from the first reproduction to the end of their life, they are either showing the territorial or bourgeois tactic, providing resources for producing offspring, or they use the parasitic tactic, exploiting the effort of such bourgeois individuals. So this can be caused either by genetic divergence, and we have one system that we have been investigating in detail that shows such divergence, and that is actually showing a Mendelian polymorphism, so that the parasitic males only produce parasitic offspring, parasitic male offspring, and the bourgeois males only show bourgeois male offspring, which is dependent on one gene on the sex chromosome. Or it may also be dependent on early experience. For example, if you are growing up in a bad environment because of seasonal reasons, yeah, because you have been born late in the season, so you only have a short period of fast growth before winter comes, for example, in our environments, then you will be small in the next spring. Yeah, and that allows you only, if you can reproduce already as a yearling, as a year-old individual, that allows you only to apply a parasitic tactic, because you cannot compete with larger individuals that provide resources to females. Yeah, so such what we call birthday effects, in seasonal environments, the time of birth can determine your tactic also for their entire life. The alternative is that you can show both behaviors, and that is very frequent also, for example, in guppies, that show both tactics with different frequencies. One tactic is the courtship tactic, so that individuals court for females and the female accept their courtship and copulate with males that they select, so they choose the males, or they may surreptitiously and sort of forcefully copulate with females against their interest. Yeah, they just use a moment of inattentiveness of the female and copulate with the female. I should add that guppies, even though they are fish, they have internal fertilization. So, so the female carries the embryos inside her body, so the fertilization has to happen inside. So this would be an example, and there are many examples. It's very widespread, as I said, in fish and in other animals, that you direct your behavior, whether you invest into advertising your quality and your resources that you can provide to the female, to potential partners. That would be the bourgeois tactic. Or you exploit the situation that, for example, in a neighboring nest, a bourgeois male is not attentive, and you can quickly just surreptitiously move into that nest and fertilize some eggs when a female is spawning there, like happens in sticklebacks, for example.
Mm-hmm. And so when we are talking about fixed reproductive strategies, are these in any way genetically encoded? I mean, are they fixed action patterns? As I mean, in common parlance, people usually talk about them as instincts, right? But the correct phrase for it is fixed action patterns. I mean, are they that or not?
Yeah, we have to be a bit careful with the term fixed action patterns.
Yeah.
Fixed action patterns implies that a certain behavior is sort of unmodifiable by momentary influences.
Yeah.
And that is actually something that is, well, in a way, it is only possible in a sort of very limited way, because usually for any kind of behavioral response, information from the environment, maybe abiotic, biotic environment, social environment, whatever, is necessary to come up with the correct response. So the action pattern can only be fixed to an extent that it involves the conditional response to the momentary environmental situation. And with environmental, I also include social environments. But with regard to the basis of your question, whether there is a genetic reason for showing a tactic throughout life, there are these two possibilities that I mentioned already. When you have fixed behavioral tactics, like, for example, bourgeois and parasitic tactics that remain the same for life, you can either have a genetic mechanism that causes one or the other behavior, or you can have early experience that causes individuals to specialize in one or the other life history for their entire lives. If it is a genetic mechanism, this can only persist in a population if both tactics on average have a similar reproductive success over a lifetime. Yeah. So if you are born as a parasitic male, you have similar chances to produce a certain number of offspring as if you're born as a male that later on will be a bourgeois provider of resources for females. And this has been shown, for example, in our cichlids, Lake Tanganyika cichlids that breed in snail shells. There we have a particular morph which we call dwarf males, because they are tiny in comparison to the bourgeois males. Bourgeois males are about 40 times heavier or bigger than dwarf males, so it's an enormous difference. And these dwarf males remain small for life, so that they are never able to defend the nest and to collect snail shells for females to breed in. So there is no other way for them to reproduce than to sneak past the female that is spawning in the shell and fertilize the eggs from inside the shell. So they rely on the possibility that bourgeois males defend the nest, attract females, provide brood care because they defend the shell after the female has spawned. Because otherwise they cannot reproduce. Yeah, they are not able to defend a shell or to provide a protection against the predators of offspring. So you see that there is a mutual dependence or there is at least a dependence of dwarf males on the investment or effort of bourgeois males. But for the tactic to persist, on average, they must have similar amounts of offspring that they can produce over a lifetime than nest males, the bourgeois males. And the mechanism underlying this similar reproductive output of both tactics involves not only the production of offspring, but also the time they have for reproducing. Because the dwarf males are, as the name says, very small, it takes a short time for them to grow up to sexual maturity. So after 2 to 4 months, they are sexually mature and can start reproducing. The bourgeois males take about 2 years or even more for starting to reproduce. When a bourgeois, a nest male, starts to reproduce, a dwarf male is already dead. They hardly survive beyond 4 months. But they have already produced their offspring. They are fewer, yeah, than the bourgeois male, but as they have a higher chance to reach reproductive state, yeah, because it takes a shorter time until they can start reproduction. Over the lifetime, we have estimated that the number of offspring they produce on average is similar to the number of offspring that the bourgeois males produce. And this is a necessary precondition for such genetically caused polymorphism, as we call it, to be evolutionarily stable.
Mm-hmm. I understand. So it's a complex and nuanced picture there, and it also depends, I guess, on the circumstances and the species we are talking about. But when it comes to an acquired sexual reproductive strategy, let's say, as you were saying a couple of minutes ago, that there are circumstances where even for a fixed reproductive strategy, the kind of strategy that a particular individual adopts might depend on the circumstances or conditions that it experiences in early development. Does the mechanism behind that as necessarily to be epigenetical, or could it just be some sort of learning behavior or something like that? Do you know something about that?
Well, of course, epigenetic mechanisms can be involved and are likely to be involved. But of course, you can also think of very simple triggers, like, for example, body size. Yeah. So, as in the example that I mentioned before, if you're born late in the season, and then next year when you start reproducing, you are small. Yeah. Your small body size and correlated with that very low competitive ability to compete with others for reproduction, for potential mates, can cause you to to stick to the parasitic tactic or the satellite tactic or whatever it is called, because in comparison, if you are born early in the season and you are large already in the next season and you compete for mates, you will realize very quickly that you are able to defend the territory and to provide resources and to court for females and be attracted to females and attract mates. So you have a very, very simple underlying learning mechanisms that is based on the current cues that you have. And that provides information to you about your own competitiveness in comparison to the conspecifics you're competing with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and in terms of reproductive strategies, is there any relationship between the kind of reproductive strategy that an individual adopts and its life history phenotype? I mean, I've already talked about life history strategies in my show several different times, so it basically has to do with different kinds of behavior, like, for example, achieving sexual maturity faster or slower, investing more or less in offspring, the kinds of reproductive strategies that a particular individual adopts, acquisition and consumption of resources and things like that. But is there that kind of relationship there between the reproductive strategy that a particular individual adopts and its life history phenotype?
Yes, exactly. That is an important point. Perhaps I can illustrate it again with our snail breeding cichlids.
Yeah.
In these snail breeding cichlids, as I already said, the dwarf males, the small morph, they develop much faster because it only takes a few months until they can start reproducing, and then they reproduce at a very high rate. They remain small, so they have a high mortality risk. Yeah, the smaller you are, the more predators can take you. So they really follow a life history strategy: live fast, die young. Whereas the bourgeois males, they have to survive for quite a long time until they can start collecting shells. Yeah, they need to pass a certain body size to be able to collect shells, to carry them actually physically, it's demanding, and also to compete with others, with conspecifics for defending a territory and such nests consisting of shells, of empty snail shells that are used by females for breeding. So these males take 2 years or longer until they can even start reproducing, and then they, when they are big enough to compete with others for females and for such nests, then they can have very, very high reproductive rates. They can. I mean, we have found in the field, we have found nests with more than 20 females at the same time in one nest. So the male produce, and with each female they can fertilize about on average 70 to 100 eggs. So you can imagine this is a very, very high number of offspring that they can produce. Of course, only a small proportion will survive, but anyway, they have a very high reproductive potential. So they have the opposite strategy over their lifetime, which involves not only the reproductive tactic, the courtship, for example, that is involved, or the defense behavior against reproductive competitors, but also attitudes like, for example, when you start to mature, yeah, when you switch on your gonads, how much energy you invest in growth against reproduction, whether you follow what we call a capital strategy, so that you accumulate resources that you can then use for a certain period to reproduce, or an income strategy, which means that you use the resources you take up immediately for turning them into reproductive potential. Just to explain what I mean there, in our example, the dwarf males use an income strategy. So they feed and they use the energy that they obtain by food immediately by producing sperm or by trying to obtain fertilizations. Whereas the nest males, they feed a lot for a long time period until they start to defend a nest and to build a nest from these snail shells. And during that period, when they defend a nest, they don't feed. They don't eat. They stop eating for about a month. They lose about 1/3 of their body weight. But they need resources, they need reserves, and that's why we call it a capital strategy. So they need some capital to use for the time period when they defend a nest and help raising offspring that are produced by the females in their nest. So you see that there is a lot of different traits that are affected by these different reproductive tactics, so that really the entire life history differs among these alternative tactics to a large extent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my last question, since we've started by talking about cooperation and altruism, and now we were talking about reproduction, let me ask you one thing that is at the intersection of both, I guess, that is about cooperative breeding. Could you tell us what are the selective pressures, or at least the environmental conditions that lead to the evolution or the development of cooperative breeding in a particular species?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I may, I would like to briefly explain that cooperation is one way to cope with competition, but of course another way to cope with competition is to show contest behavior. Yeah, so you can exclude others from resources if you are competitive enough. If you are better than others, then you can exclude others. Or a third possibility is to what we call scramble. I mean, you can be faster than others to obtain resources. Yeah. So if resources are not defendable and you have no benefits from cooperating to obtain resources, then you can just try to be quicker in obtaining and exploiting resources. So these are the three principal ways to compete for resources. So cooperation is one way, and we should be aware of that, is one way to compete. Yeah. So we can join forces with others to compete for resources that are interesting for many others. Yeah. Conspecifics and heterospecies and individuals of other species alike. But that does not mean, if we cooperate with others, that does not mean that we do not have a conflict of interest with the ones with whom we cooperate. Yeah. So even if we try to outcompete others by cooperating, once we have obtained the resources, of course there is competition among us, among the ones that we're cooperating or are cooperating, who gets which share. Yeah. So we need to be aware of the fact that cooperation, and this is of course bringing me to your question, cooperative breeding, which involves cooperation as the term says, does not exclude competition among individuals in the group. Yeah, and that is a very interesting aspect of cooperative breeding. So to get back to get to the core of your question, which conditions select for cooperative breeding? There are mainly, it's not the only important thing, but there are mainly two environmental conditions that select for cooperative breeding. One is what we call habitat saturation. So that for young individuals, and this is usually the case that young organisms are not as competitive as older ones. So young individuals, when they start to reproduce, they do not find enough resources in the environment that they can compete for successfully, yeah, because they are all monopolized by older individuals that have a higher competitive potential. Yeah, so that is one reason. The other reason is that it may just be too dangerous to disperse and search for for places in the environment where you can reproduce on your own successfully. So it is a better strategy to remain in your home place, maybe a territory defended by your parents or by dominant individuals. Maybe better to stay there until you are large enough to compete with others for resources. And this can be well illustrated by fish, for example. I mean, fish are particular among the vertebrates, at least in comparison to birds and mammals, that they do not stop growing when they are sexually mature. There are a few fish groups that do stop growing when they're sexually mature, but most species continue to grow. So that means that a young fish is smaller than an older fish. So as body size determines or strongly influences competitiveness, smaller or younger individuals are less competitive, so they do better in staying home for a longer period to grow to a size where they are competitive enough to reproduce independently. And that is one reason how we can explain the evolution of cooperative breeding. Cooperative breeding means that for a certain period of your life, you postpone or you do not reproduce independently. You postpone your own reproduction. Yeah, you just help others to raise offspring, and these others may be full sisters and brothers or half sisters and brothers, or they may be completely unrelated. And in the system that we investigate in our Lake Tanganyika cichlids, it is a mixture of both. We have both related and unrelated individuals within a group, which makes these cichlids particularly suited to study selection mechanisms that can cause this altruistic behavior to raise offspring of others, even if they are not related with them. Mm-hmm. And if I may explain the major underlying mechanism, how this can be explained, because kin selection is not involved as they are not related. There is some kind of negotiation process between the group members, the subordinate small individuals in the group, and the large dominant breeders that works in a way that we call pay to stay. So the small individuals have to pay rent to be tolerated in the territory. They benefit by protection. Yeah. So virtually the only chances to survive in this very competitive environment is to be a group member. But they are only allowed to stay in a group if they're not related to the breeders, if they pay something, if they help the breeders to raise offspring. Yeah. So the breeders demand from them to invest in the raising of their offspring, in the defense of their offspring, in providing shelters for their offspring. And if these helpers, as we call them, do not participate in these seemingly altruistic behaviors, they are expelled from the territory, and then they have very little chances to survive. So there is a sort of intricate negotiation process between the dominants and the subordinates about how much the subordinates, which have to provide some help to the dominants to raise their offspring, how much they actually have to pay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Taborsky, that is all very fascinating, but let's end the interview here. Before we go, would you like to mention what are the best places on the internet for people to find your work?
Well, I mean, you can Google our division or Google my name, and then you find our webpage. And on our webpage, we have all our papers freely available. So if you're interested, you can download PDFs about our work, and you find some general information also about our work. So I think that's the best place to get informed about the results that we obtain with our research.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. And Dr. Taborsky, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show and share your work with us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the interview and for the interesting questions. It was a pleasure for me. Thank you very much, Ricardo. Bye-bye.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karin Litske and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klimpy, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Belby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers is our Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.